Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of What Makes You Click. I'm very pleased this week to have with me Alexandra Horowitz from upstate New York and author of Inside of a Dog, which if you haven't read, you should. New York Times bestseller, and we'll get to talk about that. And I didn't realize actually until quite recently, but Alex's first degree is in philosophy, and I think that probably explains why she has some very cool experiments. Her master's and a PhD are in cognitive science, and she's just finished a new book. When is that out?
Next fall. Next
autumn. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about that. You can maybe tell us what's in there. And as I said, it does some really cool science. I know it's one of the things that lots of people talk about, and we will get to it, but the guilty look. A lot of people have heard about the experiment, but actually sort of what it shows and what it doesn't, I think is one of those things that's sometimes misunderstood, misrepresented. So we'll drill down to that. But welcome. Thank you for joining me.
It's my total pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I said last time we saw each other was in Norway at an event run by Turid Rutgers, and I must get in touch with her and see if she'll do one of these as well. But you're here today, and you're the focus of my attentions. And I said I'm just so lucky that I contact people and they just say yes. So,
I think that might be a testament to you.
I don't know about that. You're so polite. I love American flattery. Anyway, so yeah, in your research interest, you listed three things. When I asked you: naturalistic observations of domestic dog social play, empirically testing anthropomorphism, and characterizing dog olfactory ability. And again, as I said at the beginning, you do some really cool experiments. You know, you do the mainstream stuff that we all do, but there's a couple like particular experiments that I think I really like. There's the guilty look one. There's the olfactory mirror. The one of the other ones, I think is in the same league, is the one of Adam's group with the stimulus enhancement, where they do the cups and whatever. But I mean, yeah, it sounds a bit daft, but where do those ideas come from? I mean, is it because you do those observations and whatever? And I'm just wondering, because they're very neat little experiments. And to me, that's the real stroke of genius, is you take something really quite complicated and strip it down to such a neat, simple experiment, which afterwards you think, yeah, that's so obvious. I could have done that. I just didn't think about it. I mean, are these things like the guilty look things that have bugged you since you were a child, or you just one day just thought, I'm going to do that experiment?
Definitely not something I thought about since I was a child. And I wasn't trained as an experimentalist, in cognitive science. We were exposed to a lot of different approaches. But as you said, my, undergraduate degree was in philosophy, and I was very interested in just, pursuing hoary questions. And what my cognitive science training did for me, my time in graduate school, was got me to be a really keen observer of animal behavior. And I kind of consider myself an ethologist more than experimentalist. And my dissertation was behavioral observations. It wasn't an experimental study. So when you take those two things, like observing a lot and then with this ubiquitous animal who wound up being my subject, the dog, and you have this just tendency to try to analyze and unpack, I think that's where I come up with it. So, I'm looking at how people interact with their dogs and think about their dogs and talk about their dogs. And then I'm thinking, they say that the dog feels proud or guilty, or I say that the dog feels proud or guilty, but let's explore that a little bit. Like, let's dig into it a little bit. But as simply as possible. I mean, I am not as interested in creating a whole elaborate situation in order to test something. I want it to be plain and clear and straightforward, minimal variables. So at some level, I think that's where it comes from. I mean, the olfactory mirror is a little bit different because I'd always had this interest in metacognition and theory of mind. And that is by its nature a little more complex and intransigent to experimentation. But I'd gotten so focused and interested in olfaction that my way of looking at dog behavior was much more with their olfactory world in mind. And so I feel like I could see it or imagine it a little bit better. And I hope that experiment was actually pretty straightforward too, even though it's much more complex than the guilty look. But I feel like it's been a privilege to be in this field that kind of burgeoned, right, in the last 20 years, because there wasn't a lot of precedent, right? So that we can create experiments and studies based on what seems most relevant to us at the moment, and our interests, and something that somebody comes to us with, a question that a person who lives with a dog asks me. I could say, oh, well, I mean, I don't know, but I'd love to test that empirically, as opposed to kind of much more established fields of science where you're pursuing a line of inquiry that's already really well established, and you're going to do some like small variation on the theme. Here it feels like you can concoct experiments much more readily, and I enjoyed that.
I think one of that always reminds me of the thing my dad said to me. He said, not that I ever took any of his advice, but I'm just lucky I stumbled into this field. And he said, you've made a good choice there. The way to get on in academia, find a field no one knows anything about, and you soon become the world's expert. And it is nice with the dogs because it is such untouched territory. You can dip into this and you can dip into that, and okay, Adam seems to have done pointing to death. You won't mind.
It was more than a dip.
Even more than a dip. But I sort of think, oh, let's try that. Let's see what we find there. And you don't have to, it's not a field like if you went into biochemistry, you'd have to be an expert in the Krebs cycle and the minutiae of it. You can just sort of, let's try that one and see what happens in that area. But you must have been a good observer of behavior, not since your graduate school, you growing up surely, because as I said, it's clear in your books as well. You are a great observer. And I find it hard to believe that that's something that came later on in life. I guess
I didn't think about it, and maybe it was just a natural tendency I have, right? I certainly had a sensitivity to and appreciation of non-human animal life and interest in it, but I hadn't pursued it in any formal way, really. And so I think certainly doing ethology requires a certain kind of temperament. Some people are completely not made for it, and maybe I'm more made for it than others. And there are other people who spend, I didn't spend years in the field looking for my subject before I got to observe them, right? So I might be somewhere in the middle, but it wasn't until grad school that anybody trained me in the mechanism of studying dogs. And I got to study with Mark Beckoff a little bit just because I rang him up and said, gee, I want to study dog play based on what you and Colin Allen have written about play, and like, tell me how, because there was nobody at my school who was studying dogs. And in fact, everybody kind of rolled their eyes at me when I said I might be studying dogs. And so I had to study other animals at my college. But Mark really introduced me to looking at the dog as a study subject. And that happened then. Well, now that's quite a while ago. Now that's over 2 decades ago.
Ooh, goes quick, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I just stumbled into it. It just didn't occur to me that you couldn't study dogs.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, ignorance is bliss. For my research career, I've just stumbled into things, and I don't know. I just sort of started out and just thought, well, these are fun things, and I was.
Well, how did you start initially, though? What did you think? You were going to graduate school for?
I didn't go to graduate school.
Oh.
Did you know that? Okay, it's a confession here.
Let's back up.
Let's back up. So, my background is I qualified as a vet. I went into practice, had a great time in practice, and then in Lincolnshire, they set up the first degree in equine science in the country. And the agricultural colleges were all dying on their feet, and they saw this as diversification. There was a BA in Warwickshire, but this was the first BSc, and they were told they needed 2 people to complete the complement. This is their first foray into higher education. So the 2 people they needed was one to teach the equine behavior module and one to teach the equine health. And the main people fronting it up were a couple of people who'd graduated from a master's MSc in equine behavior that was run by Aberystwyth, Eve and Catherine. And the guy in charge of the college at the time was a wily old Yorkshireman. He said, well, stuff that, I'm not getting 2 people, I'll get 1 person to do 2 jobs. So he put an advert out for a vet with an interest in behavior. And it appeared in the sort of veterinary rag that advertises the jobs. And I was thinking, well, I enjoyed doing, and I was already doing problem behavior stuff. So
with horses or with,
no,
had you studied horse behavior per se or smaller animals?
No, well, I beat my first.
It's all coming out.
Yeah, hang on, this is going to be me chatting to you. Hang on, not me. But anyway, so my first few years was spent with a small animal charity for people who couldn't afford veterinary care. Then I moved into mixed practice. I did a little bit of horse work, but not much at all. And I turned up for interview, and there were 3 of us. I remember being interviewed. 2 had PhDs, and then there was me. And I was very interested in companion animal behavior, and I was doing behavior consultations. An interview, they asked me about it, and I said, yeah, I can do that. I was thinking, I've still got my notes fairly fresh from university. I can do this. And I said, but I think there's a market for undergraduate degrees in behavior, because at that time, the only training in animal behavior was at postgraduate level. And they offered me the job. 2 years later, I wrote the first undergraduate degree, I think, in the country in animal behavior. And the interesting thing is that I think partly because I wasn't trained in behavior, I had just read voraciously, and so was not schooled in one particular way of thinking about things. And B, Christine Nicol at Bristol, who'd been my mentor at Bristol, if I had any questions, I could always just go to her, and and she mentored me far more than she has any idea. I'd ask her something, and she'd say, oh yes, yeah, something, because I'd say, I've got this idea, has anybody thought of this? And so, yes, that's from the 1920s. she's always lovely, but why don't you try reading this, and you'd see, yeah, 1920s, okay. But then because it was an equine science degree, and we had this great equine facility, I did my PhD while being a lecturer. And I was running practicals where we were doing stuff like, doing pointing in dogs. And I never even thought to write it up, because I didn't really think I'd be an academic, I guess. And then you think, oh, I probably should have done that. I mean, like the Ainsworth strain situation test, I think first did that. Well, it was mid-90s.
Wow. Very early. Yeah. That would have been the first time that had been done with dogs, for sure.
It's just one of those things that you come together, and I had loads of students looking for these projects and the practicals and stuff, and so it was a busy time. But I'm self-schooled. And
well, at some level, I think that maybe accounts for your widespread interests, your really varied interests, is that there's no person you came up under whose sort of, I was going to say religion, but what I meant is like scientific approach you have to follow.
And the other thing is, as I said, I just sort of blunder into things. I'm not afraid to ask anybody anything. And people just always were so generous to me. And that's one of the reasons why I started these podcasts was, as a 4th year of vet school, because it's an undergraduate degree in the UK, I'd seen practice with Roger Mugford in the UK. And he said, look, if you're interested in problem behavior, you need to go to the States. That's where it's happening. And he gave me a list of names, and I wrote to these people, and, schooly undergraduate. And I didn't realize that, they were leading professors and people. And I've remained good friends with them all since then. And they all said, yeah, come and visit.
That's fantastic.
And I think that, I've been so lucky at that level. Because it is true that, once I got my PhD, which was fairly late on, but yeah, doors do close. You know, once you're setting up your own academic career, I have, you know, I did sense that some people, you know, none of the people I'm chatting on this sort of podcast, you know, they've all been very, very open, but you just felt that certain things changed. I don't know, but
is it a competitiveness, do you think?
I think so, yeah. But you know, most of my funding is relatively soft funding. I've been successful, but yeah, anyway, so such is life.
Yeah.
So,
I wish there were more collaborations as well, right? You know, I find it difficult to get people to want to collaborate on something, maybe because it usually does have to do with who's going to pay for it, whereas all of my research has been pretty much sort of out of pocket small grants things, not, and that's the way it's just going to be. I mean, I just assumed that was the case. It's and that allowed me to also follow my research interests, right? But so it's not my concern. My concern, if I ask somebody to collaborate with me, is like, let's do this. It'll be fun to get the answer to this. It'll be fun to design a study to test it. And why don't you do this with me? I haven't had as much receptivity as I would have thought, because I thought we're all in for it for the same reason, which is we're just like burning with an interest in answers to these questions, right?
Yes. So let's do a collaboration. Let's agree on doing a
collaboration. That was my very passive aggressive way of asking you to collaborate.
Let's collaborate. There is Anna, one of my colleagues at work, and there is in the cognition, there's this idea of trying to replicate lots of experiments and getting large sample sizes. And I've forgotten what it's called. Is it the multi-dog study or something? So
many dogs.
Many dogs. So I hope you'll be involved in that. But yeah, let's do something. As it happens,
I was involved with that in the very beginning of it, but we couldn't kind of keep up. There just was too much. Yeah, I couldn't keep up the way my lab runs. It's a little different than how other lab runs.
Yeah, so as I said, Anna's sort of more keeping in touch, but I'm not sure that much is happening at the moment, but I hope it will going forward. But well, on that topic, actually, that's a good hook. One of my colleagues in psychology is going to be doing a variant on the olfactory mirror test.
Oh, great.
And I've forgotten exactly what I should have looked this up, shouldn't I? Putting in a couple of extra controls on something, and I can't remember what they are. But anyway, just to do that. So we will collaborate on that, and I will pick your brains.
That'd be great. I have a lot of ideas about that, if you want to. So
for people who are listening in who are thinking, what on earth are they talking about, the olfactory mirror, let's explain what the olfactory mirror is.
It's so obvious.
So if people are probably familiar with the idea of the mirror test, which is this test of self-awareness. You know, do you recognize yourself in the mirror and touch yourself? And then you came up with this really neat version, the olfactory mirror. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, well, I was frustrated with the fact that, you know, the mirror mark test is an interesting test, sort of the gold standard for self-recognition, but, you know, problematic in some ways as well. And with dogs, there might be many ways in which this test is problematic. You know, for one, most but not all of the animals who've been studied doing it show some kind of grooming behavior. Dogs are not really groomers, self-groomers. And so it seems to me less likely that they would be interested in a spot on their person, on their self. And in fact, you know, if you just watch dog behavior, they don't seem to be interested in spots on themselves, right?
And why should they be interested in? And why should they be interested in mirrors either? That's the other thing.
And mirrors as well, right? And so it felt like very ethologically invalid, but primarily in my mind, because it's a visual test and we're not talking, I mean, most of the animals who we might be interested in studying outside of primates are going to be olfactory animals. And so I thought, well, that seems relevant to their ordinary behavior. Let's look at whether they'd recognize their own scent and notice if their scent had changed, which is essentially one way of, I had to kind of reconsider, what did it mean to recognize yourself in the mirror with a spot? And I think it was, oh, that's myself, but it's been changed. And so I'm going to explore it. I think that's sort of the essence of what was happening in the mirror mark test. So I thought, all right, let's look at that's my smell, but it's been changed. So can I explore it? Will I explore it more? Because I think that's me, but something odd is on top of that. So I'm more interested in it. And so we had owners who thankfully owners who participate in our studies are so delightful and willing, and they gathered, the dog's urine, because I thought that was the best representation of self that I could capture, insofar as they're often leaving that representation of themselves for others and examine others' representations of themselves via urine, on the built environment. And then we, presented them with just a very small amount of it, as well as other odorants. And one of them was that smell modified, made a little bit different, sort of with a spot on it, with a mark, to see if they would investigate it longer.
So that's what that I just remembered now what the variant is. It's terrible. I'm co-supervising this student. We're doing it in multi-dog households and using,
we did multi-dog households, and we had, and actually, here's a variation that I think is would be very interesting. So we called them friends or family. I forget what it was. F is all I remember, is the representation of it. And they sniffed those friends' odors, similar length of time to their own, not significantly more than their own. Whereas if it was an unknown dog's odor, they sniffed it much more, as you'd expect they would do out in the world. And so in retrospect, and if you're going to continue it, I would advise you to take this tack. I would have liked to have marked the family dog's odor as well.
That's what we're doing. That's exactly.
Great.
I think we're doing that because I think you suggested in the paper.
Yeah. I think I wish I had, but I hadn't thought ahead like that far. But
well, as I said, we'll keep you informed and we'll get you involved in it as well, because so for the benefit of people listening in, your findings were that yes, the dogs did.
That they sniffed their marked odor, right? Their reflection in the olfactory mirror that had been changed more often than they did, longer than they did their own odor. So they seemed to notice there was something different. And they also sniffed it longer than just that odor by itself. So it wasn't that the odor was just so interesting, that they're like, oh, now it smells like this new odor, and that's what's fascinating. It was something about the fact that it was their own smell, it was themselves, but changed, that drove their interest or sniffing investigation. So I felt like it was, not evidence of a representation of self, but certainly compelling, and certainly more ecologically valid than putting a mirror in front of a dog and then claiming something about what they know about themselves based on their behavior.
I think, it's interesting. Anna, that I mentioned earlier, she actually, a lot of her work is on reptiles. And Moses is a pet redfoot tortoise, and Moses was the first reptile to be shown capable of social learning. And she came at it from the point of view of people are taking reptiles, testing them at room temperature, guess what?
Wow.
In completely ecologically irrelevant tasks. Now, let's just try and reshape this, and guess what? They can learn. And people are saying, oh, hang on. They're supposed to be thick. They're reptiles. And you're thinking,
right.
Well, just make it ecologically relevant. And if I shove you in the deep freeze, your IQ score goes down on a test. So, just simple little things like that. And it's so actually that's one of the, where do you stand on owners being present in your tests with dogs? Because I have this, it is a difficult one, but I'm just intrigued where you stand with it, because this idea that, you take the dog away from the owner so the owner isn't interfering, but dogs react differently to the absence of their owner. So this idea that it's a homogeneous sample, to me, is just complete bunkum.
Well, I'm glad I agree with you. Otherwise, you would have called all my research bunkum just there in the fell swoop. We always have the owners in the rooms because of that. The dog's behavior is going to change drastically, and some are unwilling to participate or unable to participate. In fact, if their people are not there, right? They're just desperate to get over to where their people are, like behind the door. So it's confusing to me why you wouldn't have the person in the room. That said, given all the things we know about how influential a person is and what the dog will do or thinks they're able to do or wants to, we have to have the owner somehow like minimally involved. And in this particular study, what we did to do that, because the owner releases the dog to go investigate these samples and so that we can measure how long they sniff, is that we gave the owner a task that had nothing to do with the study in any way, but just would preoccupy them, which was to count how many times, I think in this one, it was to count how many times the dogs looked back at them.
Right.
And so at the end, it was very funny because, I feel sad deceiving the owners a little bit, right? Although there's always that
got used to you by now.
Of deception in my studies, right? And in psychology. But so at the end, the dog, they would gather up the dog. Their dog was finished with investigating, and then the owners would, proudly yell out like 12. And I would forget for a minute what they were talking about. But we would assiduously record it. Yes, it's 12. Okay. And maybe, who knows, we could have even come up with something that was meaningful to our study. But what that did was enable the dog to be with their person, for the person to not be influencing the dog behavior in any way. In fact, not even really attentive to what we were interested in the dog doing. Instead, just like zoned in, focused on this other level of thing happening. So present, but kind of not involved, right? And that's the problem. If you get them involved, then there's a lot of complexity there.
Yeah. I mean, and we do obviously, some of the studies we have owners present, some we don't. But as you say, if you don't have the owner there, then the dogs can just refuse to work, and it can be really difficult. I can look back now and sort of find it amusing, but at the time it was rather annoying. I remember one of the early studies that I went to publish, the referee said it was unscientific that the animals had names. They should have numbers. And I just thought, no, because the thing is, if you give them names, you also know in the next paper whether it's the same horse. If I just called them numbers, you wouldn't know. And we have, a limited supply of horses. So, at
the minimum,
it's a label anyway. So, you do get some people who have a very narrow view of what science is and what's scientific, I think. And it's
over the course of our studying dogs, I think a lot of that attitude has started to shift. Maybe because there has been a critical mass of people then following you or me into the field, and so now who are appreciative of the animal qua animal, not as just qua subject, right? But I think that when I started, that was the same thing. I remember, and there's just there were really uninformed understanding of dogs generally, right? I remember a master's student who wanted to do a study on something that involved visual component with dogs, and she was at a different college, and the IACUC, the Animal Use and Care Committee, which approves all of our studies that they're meeting the standards of welfare, they wouldn't approve her study because they insisted that dogs are colorblind and therefore couldn't see these stimuli. And despite the fact that, that I was one of her advisors and that we were, showing the evidence that the dogs were not colorblind, just was sure that was the case with dogs and would not approve the proposal. So there were some really backwards, I think, understandings of dogs.
Well, also backward understanding of what it means to be colorblind. Colorblind doesn't mean you can't see color,
Right.
It's like
that's true as well, right? Right.
I'm colorblind.
Yeah. Are you colorblind?
Yeah, but I've got a weird form of colorblindness, and I only discovered it a few years ago when we were doing a thing at the Royal Society, and as part of it, we had this display about crypsis and detecting texture and stuff like that. And if the cards that you have with the dots with the numbers,
Yep.
I can do those fine generally. But there was this experiment we were actually running, and I was thinking, I can't see anything. And one of the professors there, because it was a collaboration with, I think it was with Exeter, he said, you've got whatever form of color blindness it is. He said it's much more common in females than males, but it's an unusual. So for me, things that are sort of olivey colored, they will either be brown or green depending on the lighting and stuff like that, and they change really dramatically for me. So I can't distinguish certain greens and browns.
Wow.
But I also have enhanced sensitivity around that color as well, which is really weird. But
have you figured out, is there a way in which it affects your life, just sort of daily life? Is there a type of thing that comes in those colors?
There was one other event I had at vet school when we were looking at sheep abortions and the samples, and the guy said, the pink stippled stuff at the top, and I was thinking, well, I can see a granular thing, but there's no difference in color for me. And he thought, are you sure you're not colorblind? I was 23 at the time. Well, I haven't noticed up until now. So there was that one other occasion, but
what I like about this, just the notion that you could go, well into adulthood, not knowing that there was something perceptually slightly different about you than the average, the norm. I feel like that's like a very nice analogous example of how we feel about non-humans. Sort of, we assume like just everybody sees everything like we do. They just have the exact same sensory experience. And we've entirely discredited, as, in science, for the most part, all these multiple realities and ways of perceiving and types of attention. And I think that's fascinating to me. And that you'll even see this continuing now that we know, and now that people appreciate the bats, sonar, or the ultraviolet perception of the honeybees or something like that, that still people are resistant to saying that like it has a reality, or that there could be anything other than what my mind thinks.
And I have no idea that, there is probably a color that you see that I don't see. And I have no idea what that could be like.
Yeah. This goes back to the philosopher's questions were always like this. I think that's why this stuff intrigues me. And I thought, I love the form of question. And then I always thought science would kind of answer it. And as it turns out, especially the science we're in, it's much more, I've found that it's much more a process of exploration than it is a process of like answering and coming up with nailable facts that are going to withstand any resistance.
So while we're on, and we'll get to umwelt anyway, because as I said, that's always been my view. But just another, when at school I did ancient Greek, and the Greeks didn't have a word for blue, so they described the sky as being bronze. Right.
Brilliant.
Because it was the reflection, because that's the colors they work with. I discovered a few years ago, if you're Russian, your rainbow has 8 colors. We have 7, because they distinguish an extra form of blue. And people think of rainbows as bands of color. Well, there is no band. That's all. That's just our brains imposing it. So Russian brains impose 8 bands. And I think,
that's great.
So cool, isn't it?
That's very cool. I love that.
Yeah, you just think, so much of what we construct, we construct the world around us, and okay, so this gets us. We may as well talk a bit more about dogs rather than our own lives, but color blindness. So, in the case of dogs, obviously, all dogs have a fantastic sense of smell, but I just increasingly wonder, they've retained the sense of smell, but actually fitting in with humans involves a lot of ignoring your sense of smell and using your vision, even though it's not very good. And that's perhaps what sets them apart more than wolves, is actually that shift. You're nodding, and that's reassuring.
I think so. I mean, and I should say, if we go back just for a second to the olfactory mirror test, that initially I couldn't get dogs to participate in the study. and maybe Anna will have the same problem, because dogs were loath to sniff, to go and sniff. If you sort of say, if you let, if I create a little experimental room that has almost nothing in it, so just a couple of things, hopefully that the dog will find more interesting, and maybe we draw attention to them by having somebody, stand behind them at whatever it is. Nonetheless, when you sort of let a dog go and to do what they're going to do, the dogs I was finding who were volunteered by their people were not spontaneously going to examine things by smell. Mm-hmm. And I realized, of course, that, most dogs live their lives being told not to smell when they're with their people. That's, if you watch people on a walk, especially on leash with their dog, they're constantly pulling their dogs away from smelling things, all manner of things, any kind of thing.
So let me just jump in, because a few years ago, you'll love this, I hope you love it. I had an undergraduate student, and what we did is we put urine trails around, and we looked at how long the dog sniffed at things. And in one situation, they were given all the time they wanted, and in the other, the dog was interrupted after 5 seconds. And of course, if you interrupt the dog, he wants to spend longer at the next one, which is the same urine sample, because it's a half-finished sentence, like me jumping in at this point.
It's great.
And
that's great,
because
I do love that.
Yeah, when I can't remember the figure, but it was something like, if the dogs were not interrupted, it would be about 12 seconds. What owner stands around for 12 seconds and allows their dog to investigate? And we'll have to do it again. I have to do it again. I'll have to find the thesis and dig it out. So it was just an undergraduate piece.
It's brilliant. And I think it's right. I mean, hopefully it's changing a little bit. I know after I wrote Inside of a Dog, and I started hearing from a lot of people who had changed their way of interacting with their dogs on walks, and simply just, switch their thinking about what was happening when their dog was walking and when their dog was sniffing other dogs or sniffing the environment, and just, so I do meet a lot of people now who intentionally let their dogs explore things by smell or participate in scent games or whatever it is, so that they're getting back to their kind of, natural self. But I think, rounding back to your point, I do think it's right that dogs have enough kind of perceptual flexibility that they can work in the visual world, which we create for them. We're creating visual stimuli, our faces are meaningful to them, all these things. And yeah, they can do it if we kind of enforce it on them. And so one wonders, when that dog then wanders into our study, what's their tendency? Are they going to, revert to what they'd like to do? Or are they going to do what they're kind of always asked to do in the human environment? Probably the latter.
Yeah. So a few years ago, I had a master student. We did publish the work. We had cats in a tea maze, and the cats had to learn where the food reward was, and they could use either an olfactory or a visual cue. So let's say on one cat flap, there was a red dot smelling of strawberries, and the other one, it was a yellow dot smelling of bananas. It's all counterbalanced. The hardest thing was training the cats, needless to say. They kept jumping out of the tea maze, etc. But and then once they'd learned that, we then crossed the cue. So you now had a red dot that smelled of bananas and a yellow dot that smelled of strawberries. And the thing that the result that we got was that 90% of the cats went with the visual cue, which really, really surprised me. But the thing that, and this is the experiment I'd really like to do, is 10% didn't. And approximately 10% of cats have house soiling problems. I just wonder, and it was a small sample, but I love it when you get a result like that and you think, I wonder if they live in that 10% live in an olfactory world, and that's why they're more likely to urine spray at home.
Wow. That's so interesting.
That'd be cool.
Yeah, it would be cool.
So if we can recruit lots of spraying cats, let's get them into a tea maze. And I just wonder how they'd perform in that task.
Yeah.
Because it just think the world that they live in, and then you think, their world is so different. Yeah. And that was one of your other papers, that really cool thing. and it's just sort of, it's almost like a footnote in it, isn't it? Where the dog's actually more likely to reject the food if it's a strong smelling plate with unfamiliar odors.
Right.
And
Right.
everybody is using all these washing up liquids and stuff like that, and thinking, oh, it smells nice, etc.
Yeah.
And just think, yeah, do you really
Absolutely.
want, your washing powder on your chips,
Right. It's disgusting. And
Yeah.
I think too, now that the world is being cleaned with isopropyl alcohol but that's how also we used to clean our lab between sessions, is like filtered, watered down cleaning, so that we don't have sort of this remnant cues from other dogs or the treats that we were using and so forth. But on the other hand, I have to be alert to the fact that we're adding this like unpleasant stratum of odor to all the dog's environments who come in there. And it's trying to really create a controlled olfactory environment in a quasi-naturalistic setting is very tough. And I maybe the reason there haven't been more studies that really pay attention to or talk about smell with all these dog behavior and cognition researchers is that it's just challenging to do, right? We're so oblivious to the things that they might be perceiving in the environment that we're just like, we'll just set up these important visual distinctions, and I'm sure the rest of it comes out of the wash.
No, offline, I'll tell you something about the visual task as well, because we haven't quite published it yet, and I don't want to undermine the publication.
Okay.
But there's,
okay.
I'll leave that as a teaser for people listening in. But remind me at the end when we finish to tell you about screens, because we found something quite unusual with screens. But so for cleaning, with cats that are scent marking, we often use something like a biological cleaner, and then we just wash it down with loads of water. And that's the best we can do, I think, in those situations. We have air purifiers now that we use in our olfactory experiments as well. So, they're pumping away to try and
good idea.
Minimize it. And they're not too expensive to buy. So they tend to work. But so anyway, let's talk about guilty look, shall we?
Sure.
So again, for people who don't know the experiment, basically sort of, and I know this is a complete... Owners were told that their dogs had stolen a biscuit or not, regardless of what the dog had done. And those owners who believed that their dogs had stolen the biscuit, their dogs were much more likely to show the guilty look.
Right.
So
whether they had or not.
Yeah, whether or not they had. Now, people have said, that means dogs don't show guilt. Which is not what the result is. It's
right.
And this is what I mean about it being literally holding your head. You realize that at this point.
I think this paper was published in about 2009 or something, and I've then spent the next 12 years trying to correct people on this point, and people do get it, but the fact that I wasn't actually saying anything about whether the dogs do or have the capacity to feel guilt or not is missed, because that's what we want to find out, right? That's ultimately that is people's interests. But I didn't have some x-ray of their emotional experience. I could only say what their behavior was indicating, what it was in a reaction to or not. And that said, some people too get it, that the thing that we think looks like guilt is actually something else, is actually a response to their owner. But the other response I got to that study was that, about 50% of the people who read it would say to me, I knew this all, it's obvious, like everybody knows this. And the other 50% would say, no, not my dog. No, my dog, I know you've done a study, but not my dog. My dog, definitely. And there's something so funny about that study in the world of not just science, but in perception of science by the non-scientist, where we want to take the result as definitive, but people also still love the power of, of anecdotes, and they're so convinced by their own experience and impressions that is very hard to upend them, right? A lot. I mean, have you found that as well?
Yeah, so 6 or 7 years ago, we around about this time of year, because I know it was just before Christmas, I think it was early December, we published a paper where we did the Ainsworth test in cats. And what we found was no consistent evidence that you could that suggested that the cats had an attachment in the sense of using the owner as a base of safety and security. Mm-hmm. We did not say that they didn't have a bond with their owners, but we said, the only behavior that we saw was could actually be more parsimoniously explained by just saying these cats are frustrated when their owners aren't there. Mm-hmm. So we published the paper, cats don't show signs of attachment. National press get hold of it. Scientists find out what we always knew: cats hate their owners. I got so much vitriol from that. I got emails from, I'm afraid to say, from your side of the pond. People, and I remember one saying, "I've just inherited a lot of money. I'm going to spend it on ruining your career. How dare you say this about cats?" I was thinking, I didn't say it. And and one of the, I did look at one of the streams, and there's one sort of, and this guy, it was it was social media at its worst. Then there's this one guy said, "I've just looked at this guy's site. I've read the paper, first of all, and I've looked at this guy's site, and there's a picture of him with a cat on his back as his professional page. I don't think he's a cat hater." One person who is not going to, destroy me, but I think that is something with our line of work as well. Passions run very high.
Yep.
You don't get the same result when working on pigs.
I'll never forget a person, although I wish we would, but I there was a person at one of I think it was probably a book reading, actually, when I was talking about how my general philosophy is that anthropomorphisms aren't evil. They aren't even all wrong, but they deserve some investigation. They deserve looking at and asking questions about, rather than just accepting, right, our sort of instinctive assessment. And a woman stood up and she said, "If you prove that dogs don't love us, I don't want to hear it." Right? Like, no matter what you say, I'm going to believe that they love us. And I said, well, great. But for me, it doesn't take away from the interest of the animal and the bond I have with my dogs to know, if I could say they don't feel guilt, which I cannot. Let's just say it again. I haven't said it, and I don't know how to say it or affirm it. I still would, first of all, have these feelings about them, that they have some of these secondary emotions. It's just a natural human feeling, and it wouldn't take anything away from my appreciation for them. They live in a different world. If we had discovered that they just had a different understanding of the situation that they're involved in than we do, well, that's actually not that surprising. It's okay. And I love just that discovery versus just being satisfied with the assumptions that we make.
Absolutely. And you also, the other thing we always get is this sort of, well, yes, I knew that already. No, you believed it. And that difference between belief and knowledge. But I agree with you. I remember somebody saying to me sort of, well, what you do is like, when you've, and I think the more I do stuff in dogs, and the more I think dogs are incredibly perceptive and not very cognitive, in the way that they handle things. And people say, "Oh, isn't it? Don't you find it sad when you find this?" No, and they said, "Isn't it like unmasking the magician?" I said, "Well, but when you see how a magician does a trick, that in itself is as good as the trick. It makes the trick even more impressive." Right. You think that somebody thought that through or came up with that, and just thinking that, if they can solve it using different cues that we just hadn't thought about, that is smart.
It's very clever, right? I always thought Clever Hands was brilliant, right? Oh my God, how perceptive that horse had to be. holy cow.
Yeah.
And, you know, all right, he's not doing mathematics or speaking German. Okay, that's not that surprising to me. And also, you know, why would he be? Like, let's look at his life and what the history of horses and think about whether it makes sense that he would be doing, you know, long division. No, not so much. But how incredibly astute to figure out in this like weird environments that he would have been in, with being drilled with these questions and increasingly large audiences to this charade, that he figured out what to do. So that's, to me, more interesting, frankly.
So where do you stand at the moment on all this stuff about dogs pressing buttons and language?
Oh,
well, I'm constantly being asked about this now.
I know. I've kind of refused in the press to respond anymore because I don't see any reason to give more traction to this sort of line of inquiry. I know that there are some people now trying to investigate whether at least one of the dogs, or maybe crowdsourcing many dogs' behavior is really meaningful with the button. So I guess I should be agnostic until they find out what they find out. But, you know, my very strong impression is that it's, you know, I'm very pleased that people are interested in what their dogs have to say, and that their dogs are saying nothing. And it's complete confirmation bias. It's completely, you put down a button which says something which the dog is already saying, and sometimes they'll learn to use the button. And you respond to it, and that's all that's happening. And the notion that there's something profoundly more interesting about dog behavior if they're using language is, to me, kind of off-putting. I think the dog is always communicating with us, and we've just chosen to ignore them until they can communicate in this kind of way. I just hate it. I just hate it. Yeah. I'm sorry if there's anything redeeming in it. It will have to be proven to me.
You've put it much more politely than me, so I'll remember those words and I'll rehearse them. But I heard on the radio the other week that this tech person, and again, this is where it comes up. I'll tell a side story first. You know, people, cats on iPads and stuff like that. And people, you know, they're having such fun. Well, actually, I think flashing lights and things are quite frustrating for cats because there's no consummatory action at the end. You know, they can't catch the light.
Yeah.
And people say, you know, but they wouldn't interact with it. I said, you know what? If a student writes a really bad essay, I just want to screw it up or whatever. That does not mean I'm having fun reading this essay because I'm interacting with it. They usually understand that at that level.
That's a good analogy.
But they were,
I used to say, and I think this is the case, if you put down buttons, you know, that said, you know, bloody hell, get these buttons out of my way. You know, you'd have the dog saying that, but no one ever does. They don't ever put down buttons that say, like, you know, Mars and rocket ship. And if a dog says, I want to go on a rocket ship to Mars, you know, they're asked, you know, the point is, if you put down buttons which say the things the dog's are already saying, once in a while, they'll get it. Some dogs will be motivated enough to get that this button leads to the thing. But
and Alex Rossi did that, you know, with
Sophie, already did that. And there's some neat stuff with that. But I love the idea of Mars and rocket ship. Oh my God, Jeff Bezos, quick, I've got to speak to him. Exactly.
The dog has got to go into space.
Yeah. A dog's true feelings are that they want to be sent out of this atmosphere.
Has Jeff Bezos got a dog? This is what we need to find out.
Oh God.
We can find out if his dog's got to go into space. This could be the collaboration that we've been waiting for.
Like a 2.0.
Yeah. So I was intrigued, moving on, but I was intrigued by one of your recent papers where, let me just find it because it's Can Dogs Limbo? Dogs' Perceptions of Affordances for Negotiating and Opening. And I was intrigued by it because the last year or so, I've started to get interested in the idea of affordances because of the work we do on emotion, and increasingly thinking that emotional classification of the world is basically an affordance. You know, you are the individual who cares for me. So that's, you know, this is a barrier that is in my way that needs to be destroyed. So that becomes frustration and things like that. And to me, that sort of, I'm thinking, well, this sort of starts to bring together the ideas of emotion from both the neurophysiology, but also the the stuff from Feldman Barrett on construction of emotion as well, and how dogs might construct it. We see, and especially with pain, I do wonder if dogs, they somehow, a lot of dogs we see in the clinic that are potentially anxious or whatever, there's so 85-90% of the cases now we see these dogs are in pain as well as being anxious. And okay, you can understand anxiety and anticipation, but I wonder if because of the relationship that they have with the owners, we're also seeing a shift in dogs expressing it in that way, and that's how it's coming out. But that's a separate issue. But it's just this use of the word affordances, and because I was thinking, this is really new. And of course, you got there first.
But not with emotions. I mean, I'm not talking about emotions there. It's more about, and if anything, it's a little bit about sort of their sense of themselves in space, right? Vis-a-vis the things that they can interact with or can't interact with in the environment. And I do think that actually language comes a little bit from child development, which sometimes is informative of some of the ways I'm going to do my studies, is how people have, looked at nonverbal babies, beginnings to interact with their environment. But I think you doing it with emotions or thinking about it with emotions is brilliant. The first thing that makes me think is that there are all these studies on jealousy. And I've always been very frustrated with them. And I think it's because I see the behavior that is being kind of put forth as evidence of jealousy, really just evidence of distinction of, affordances of people, right? Like, so if you have a person who's paying a lot of attention to some other dog, that person's dog might see that there's something about that person has changed, right? Like they're giving out attentions, and I want to get in there to get some of those attentions. And to me, that doesn't read as jealous behavior, but you could call it jealous behavior. But I feel like we should be more agnostic about it in the field and say, like, that's, attention getting behavior. But one way to bring emotion back into it, if I hear you correctly in what you're saying, is to imagine that jealousy really just is understanding the changing affordances of that person in a way in this context.
And I think it's, and to me, and as I said, because so you talk a lot about it, I know, inside of a dog, about umwelt, which is, and it's, for some people, it's been almost like a heresy, the idea of, it's a long-standing idea that, for those people who don't know, that, we all create our own realities and we live within our own realities and we respond to it accordingly. And depending on what senses we've got, that's the world that we live in. We're talking about sort of dogs living in a smell-dominated world, and what, Thomas Nagel's "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" Donald Griffin's story about him being held by the neck by a scientist, saying it was a complete heresy, this idea of echolocation, and suggesting that they have these, and yet we have no idea how they construct their world. But to me, the idea of affordances links really well with that, if you live in a certain, your senses affect what you can do. For people who don't know what affordances is, it basically means what you can do with something. So, I'm sat on a chair, and you can say that, well, a chair is for sitting and that's its affordance. But if somebody bursts in with an axe, I can use it as a shield. So it has a new affordance and that sort of thing. And that, to me, just makes so much more intuitive sense of how we're going to classify the world.
Yes. And that is, von Uexküll had that idea, really. He just called it a functional tone. Yeah. So the functional tone of chairs is, typically something, maybe it's nothing to a dog, right? But except for as a barrier or to something else. And but as you say, that I think it's just his way of talking about what Gibson called affordances. So I think that's a clever idea. I mean, I look forward to seeing what you all do with that. And I think it could open up emotion research in an interesting way, which I think is so fraught with non-humans where you just sort of risk over attributing or under attributing, given that I don't think we have really great behavioral mechanisms to sort of see into the animal's emotional experience. So,
but it also helps you sort of recognize that if you've got certain sensory abilities, well, that's going to determine the sort of things you attend to. The sort of things you attend to then shape what you think you can do with it. What is it for? And if your way of recognizing people is based on smell, then somebody smelling different is a different person to all intents and purposes. And that's the other thing. I think dogs are remarkable at the way that they adapt to the way we really screw with their minds. We change our pelage daily
all the time,
and our odors and everything, and they still recognize us. If my wife suddenly came down and her skin was green, I'd sort of do a double take. But dogs don't do that. And, well, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see if you come down in the morning to your dog. Oh, your dog's in bed with you. I know that from the books. But if people come down to their dogs in the morning and they're wearing the same thing as when they last saw the dog, does the dog hesitate less, or there's a slight delay if they come down in completely different clothes? Just I just wonder if they've had a shower and they smell different, that sort of thing. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I do think that our smell, our just natural smell is pretty strong, is pretty profound. It's and hence, by the way, a billion-dollar industry and products to cover up our smell. But I think the cover up is fairly superficial. And so I do think that even if we're soaped up or, cover ourselves with perfume, that we're still redolent of ourselves and certainly to the dog. But the hesitation, but you might see some hesitation. But then again, maybe what we've become per your sort of changing affordances of a substance or a person is the thing which always transforms itself in this superficial way, right? Like we always have a base note, but our over notes of smell always change.
Well, the other thing is, it's a bit like, we're primed to see faces in things. And,
right.
And I just wonder if after a dog develops a relationship, it's primed to pick out those chemicals of you. So it doesn't matter what you cover it with, because it's like a big face staring out of it saying,
right.
This is my person here,
Right.
And it's just like I love the one, Jesus in a piece of toast, right. You see that because you're looking for it and whatever, and that's what they're looking for. Okay, it's you, it doesn't matter it doesn't matter that you stink. That's just like a lot of background noise.
Right.
These things jump out of them. But now I'm conscious that I know you have to get away, but there's a couple of other things I just wanted to chat about.
We have time.
Okay. So not everybody who writes a good dog book ends up on the New York Times International Bestsellers list. And I mean, this is, to me, this is a book that is written, it's written with a lot of love as well for Pump. But also, because I was rereading it in preparation for today, I think it's poetic in places. I don't know if anyone's ever said that about this. But having given you those compliments, why do you think it was such a success? I mean, it is a good book, and obviously, but not every good book ends up on the bestsellers list.
Yeah.
And I guess so. It's more, not that I have any intention of writing a book, but if, budding authors, there's a certain formula here that clearly connects with people. I mean, there was a lot of new stuff about it. I mean, was it a conscious decision, or was it just good luck? I guess I'm asking that. I
don't think you can consciously write your way into a bestseller. I think that the circumstances, the stars sort of have to align for you. And I think there are things that helped. Maybe the way I wrote it helped, but I think the topic at the time was probably largely responsible. Meaning there wasn't a lot of, if the field of dog cognition, I think, had kind of not existed, right? Even if people, even though people were studying dogs, yourself included, it kind of hadn't consolidated. And so then when there became this growing public interest and awareness in it. But there were a lot of studies that hadn't been widely discussed outside of the, academics. And so I think my book might have been one of the first, which sort of just brought all this science to people and made it accessible. It is accessible already, but made it accessible. And it was also right at this time before the media had just taken over. So if anytime you write a study that's anything to do with attachment or emotion or anything, it's just going to be, it's going to be in the news. That wasn't happening yet. And so I think that it just captured that interest that I had myself in the science, which is, I'm looking at the science, I'm asking these scientific questions, but then here's my dog, and I can apply what I'm learning about to my interaction with her and think about her, with this in mind. And that was delightful, right? So I think that it turned out to be timing wise the right time to introduce this science to a wider public. And I think a couple of other books that have come after it, which do essentially the same thing in their own way with their own voices, also did well, right? Also had a lot of, so there was like I did not tap out the enthusiasm of people to learn about the science behind their dogs. I mean, people have these questions, and now here was a science that was answering them.
So here's a personal question. How was it received by your academic superiors and peers? Because
I didn't.
I'll explain. Let me first explain why I'm asking this, because Irene Pepperberg told me once that she was really berated for writing the book on Alex, a popular book.
Yeah.
And I said, no, that's how we get promotion at our place.
Yeah, not here. Well, I've already described a little bit how I had a fairly non-traditional path like you, and I have never wanted a tenure track position in a university. And had I been in a tenure track position, I think this would have not only been frowned on, but would have been like downright scorned, right? Like it's sort of, it not only doesn't count towards your advancement to be credentialed at the higher levels or tenured, but it also seems like a distraction. Like, why do you should be writing serious material? And I will say that over time, I've gotten a lot of positive response from academics because they want to write a popular book themselves. But at the moment, and they want to know, like, well, how'd you do it? Like, how do you do it? But at the moment, I did not hear from colleagues at all about it.
Yeah.
Which is just to say, I don't know what their opinion was. They were quiet, but I assume it wasn't accolades. It was not, but it wasn't as far as opprobrium, because I wasn't in a world where it mattered, right? I've always been a little bit adjunct to the university in that I didn't accept the sort of idea that you have to be a tenure track professor to be a professor or to do research but people have gotten more interested over time as people want to write, popular press books that get a wider readership. And by the way, make money as opposed to the books that we write for the
where we pay them to publish it.
Where we pay them to publish it, which is outrageous.
I mean, I've never made much money from any of the books that I've written. It dawned on me that I was getting like £1 for every copy of Equine Behavior which was basically my lecture notes, because I came to equine behavior and I was thinking, how would I teach this? And thinking, well, I'll treat the horses like dogs. And people thought that was quite radical. And I was thinking, oh, is it? And that was, that sold something like, I don't know, 1,000 copies a year for quite a few years. And I was thinking, I've done all right out of that. And I thought, it sells for £20 a shot. Somebody's making an awful lot of money out of this, and I'm not.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I do think that it's a bad game that we're in as academics to be having done all this labor for somebody else, and that's the thing that should count towards advancement in some posts as well.
In the UK, I mean, certainly there's a big movement about public communication of science, because well, especially in the current environment where people sort of, well, this person who's looked something up in Google, their opinion is as valid as somebody who studied this for 50 years. And you just think,
Right.
no, it shouldn't be. And yeah, having good scientists like yourself writing good books is so important compared to some of the junk that is out there. And well, so important, full stop. I shouldn't say compared to some of the junk. It is, you know, and I think it's such a useful service, and it changes people's lives. It, you know, makes their lives better. It makes the animals' lives better. And, you know, well, okay, I'm speaking as a vet, I guess. I've always been an applied scientist. That's what I'm interested in. You know, that when I shuffle off this planet, I hope it's a bit better for me having been here. And, you know, yeah, some people just the idea of, oh, you don't want to connect with the public. Well, why not? You know, it's their taxes that you're probably benefiting from in the first place. And that's been quite a big thing in the UK in recent years, that actually the public want to know what their taxes are going to fund. So anyway, so what's the new book about? Can I ask?
It's about the puppy. So it's early dog development, I guess is the way I would say it. But I decided that I'm probably not writing any more dog books related to dogs. You know, I think I might have I've said the things I need to say for now. But there were two kind of groups or times of life I hadn't written about. And the first one I thought was end of life. You know, I think actually it's a really interesting topic. Anyone who lives with an animal.
We got a paper coming out on dogs and grief. Yeah, when their fellow dog dies.
Interesting.
Run by the Italian groups. Stefania Okida is going to be the first author, but we're just doing the correction. So anyway, but yes, so let's talk about.
I mean, it's great until until recently, I don't think there has been a ton of work on that and all the parameters of it, right? Cognitive decline, grief, the fact that we have control over animals' ends of life in some way, you know, versus humans where we're perpetuating life. And I think this is fascinating, but I also felt like I can't spend a year and a half with my mind in this space of thinking about dog death. So maybe I could intersperse it with thinking about the early dog life, right? When the dog is born, and every other chapter would be dog death. And then I thought, oh, you know what? I'm just going to write about early dog life. Let's just do that. That sounds like more fun. And I have never lived with a very young dog. You know, I've gotten all our dogs from shelters, and they're several months on, so they're puppies still. But I thought, and in fact, you know, especially as the shelter adoption becomes a more popular option, and it has over the years, people aren't getting their dogs from a breeder at 7 weeks or something like that. Thank goodness. They're getting dogs whenever they get them. And often that's many months into their lives. And this whole thing has happened to the dogs already, right? Like it's a very rich part of their life. And we never know what it is. And so I thought, what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the dog, you know, through the first year of their life, from birth to a year, and write about that part of their life. And we'll adopt the dog and also follow her life sort of. So I'm wearing both scientist and owner hat. And so that's what we did. It happened. It was right as the pandemic was kind of becoming suddenly visible to everybody. I'd been looking at litters. So actually the first thing I have to say is I wanted to not get a purebred dog. I'm not interested in perpetuating pure breeding. As lovely as those dogs are, I feel like this is hugely detrimental in all the ways that we could discuss for another hour and a half, right? And so I needed to find a puppy who was born of serendipity, and some shelters and rescue groups worked with me and let me watch fosters as they were taking in pregnant mothers and having litters and so forth. And I was watching one litter, visiting them. I'd seen right after the birth and seen every week or so, 5 days or week of this litter's life as they were aging. And then the pandemic hit us all. We were all cloistered and separated from each other. And I realized, oh, if we don't adopt one of these puppies, I don't think I'm getting into another litter, right? Like this is it. So we adopted one of those puppies, and then raised her over, now she's almost 2 years old.
This is Quiddy.
And so this Quiddity, yeah. So it's about her. It's about that litter, in their formative years of early development with their mother, and then the rest of her life with us. So it's a chance for me to talk a little bit about the science of early dog development and of adolescence. It's fun that there's now this work on adolescence, but in a way, there's not a huge amount of science, frankly, of looking at puppies. There's just been some recent work that Emily Bray and all her colleagues have done out here, but I wanted to expose the world to that science, just as, inside of a dog, it was more about just, dog cognition, whatever that means, sort of the average adult dog cognition. And along the way, talk about the experience of living with a puppy for a year, which by the way was just really tough, much harder than I remembered or thought, or maybe it's even because I was viewing her as both a scientist and a owner, that just the complexity of the early days, that all the things they don't know and you need them to know, and their like wild behavior, extravagant energies, it was challenging. So I go into that as well, right? The frustration, the difficulties for me, that it's not just a straightforward scenario to bring another living being into your life. And I hope and appreciate that people shouldn't just be cavalierly getting dogs as we have for so long. I hope that at some level it reminds people that it's just not a sales, like an object you buy, which then works, right? Like we buy so many other objects in our lives.
I'm just thinking, I think that's a great point at which to end. I want to spend another hour and a half chatting to you, but that is such a good way to end, and I'm off to pre-order the book as well.
Excellent.
If I can find it.
Thank you.
I think it's going to be such a fantastic book. I really do. As I said, there's lots of other things that I would like to chat to you, but I don't want to detract from that final point, which is, as you say, you're bringing another life into your life and the responsibilities and the efforts, etc. So I think we should end it there. So thank you so much.
Fantastic.
It's lovely to catch up with you.
Likewise.
Good to see you, and I hope it won't be too long before I say we can catch up in person.
Yes, you owe me that drink at a pub next time.
Absolutely. Well, I might be coming over to New York State next summer.
Oh, good. Oh,
So
good. I'll see you there.
So hopefully, you'll probably have gone on holiday to the UK that week.
No. That's possible, but no. If I know you're coming, we'll make a date.
Take care. Thanks a lot.
You too. Thanks.
Cheers. Bye now.